Believe it or not, it's been over 6 years since the release of the absolutely baffling Metroid Other M, one of the most despised titles Nintendo has ever released. A completely confounding mix of clunky gameplay and inescapable melodrama. With Federation Force receiving even more of a critical beating though, I thought it might be interesting to return to Other M and see what we can glean now years down the line. I won't however be discussing the story. I really want to dig into Other M as a game, which is something not many people have done, and how can you really blame them when the story was such a disaster. We all know it's an absolute mess of plot holes, horribly written characters, thunderously on the nose symbolism, and makes little sense within the context of the previous Metroid games. It will always be fun to make fun of it, but not today. Instead, I'm interested in taking a look at the core gameplay of Other M and dissecting just what put so many people off this game outside the hours of unskippable drivel. After all, there are a few things the game does well. It runs at a smooth 60 frames per second, and despite lacking the terrific art design of the Prime series or its vast variety and creative environments, it does look fairly nice for a Wii game. One of the major issues here lies with the changes made to the Metroid formula. The decision that with a couple of exceptions, Samus wouldn't be finding key abilities to progress through the game. Instead, she starts with all of them and has to wait for another character to tell her when she's allowed to use them. You probably know most of the famous examples where this got pretty silly. Not activating a harmless cooling function in her suit without Adam authorizing it, not turning on another suit function for gravity control when Adam isn't even barking orders anymore, the fact that bombs aren't usable at the start even though Adam hasn't even said that he wants to be in command of Samus yet, all that stupid stuff. Having Choke Me Daddy Adam here authorizing powers whenever he feels like it doesn't just make less sense story-wise than when Samus just got shanked and lost all her abilities again at the start like in other titles, it also directly impacts the gameplay in a serious way. Powers are activated at Samus's discretion during important story beats, and that completely changes the dynamic from previous titles. One of the things that Sakamoto's Metroid games do have over the Prime series is that they allowed for a greater degree of freedom and non-linearity. Because power-ups needed to progress were physical items found in the environment, it meant they could be acquired in different orders. This was taken advantage of way more in the 2D games than the 3D ones, and a whole host of different sequence-breaking techniques could be used to beat those games in different ways. Zero Mission accommodated this so much that there were in fact secret routes that solely existed to provide the player with ways to beat the game outside of the main outlined path. Power-ups in Other M aren't found, they're activated when and where certain conditions are met in the story. This means it's basically impossible to acquire anything out of order or to explore the environment in any kind of non-linear fashion. Take this section where Samus goes through a series of morph ball tunnels before emerging at a button that can't be shot without the wave beam. You then double back, go all the way to the start of the morph ball section where a scripted event occurs. Some pirates attack Samus in a glass box, so Adam now authorizes the use of the wave beam. You're then forced to go back through the morph ball level all over again and activate the button Samus was just at. There's no way to get around this, no way to save time by finding the wave beam before your first trip up to the button. It has to be done twice because the wave beam is acquired in a scripted event. It wastes time and is just one of the many examples of Other M not allowing the player any degree of freedom or discovery within the world it presented. Sequence breaking and speedruns are heavily discouraged to the point that the game doesn't even bother showing you your time on the mission complete screen for the first time in series history. I think Samus basically served as an avatar for the player in the previous games. Samus isn't just experienced, we the player are, so being told when and where to use items felt patronizing and ran completely counter to why we play these games to begin with, to explore and discover. As I said before, items are activated at Samus's discretion. Yeah, Adam gives the orders, but she has control over her suit. She could activate any of her powers at any time if she wanted. The player obviously does want those abilities on, but Samus doesn't. And here is where we see her character lose that sense of synergy with the player. After 20 plus years of Metroid games where we were making decisions as Samus instead of waiting for her to make them for us, it's no wonder this game was poorly received by fans. You're no longer a savvy explorer of alien worlds, you're basically a gunman hired to protect Samus in battle while she makes the executive decisions. As a player, we know what items we need to access an area, but Samus just seems to be oblivious because she won't use the item we know we need to use until she feels like it. It makes us dislike Adam because he's telling us, the legendary experienced Metroid player, what to do, and we hate Samus because despite being our avatar in this universe, she makes extremely bad tactical decisions we the player never would. This framing device isn't just bad in terms of narrative and story, it affects the gameplay, falls apart under about all levels of scrutiny, and hampers just about every aspect of the game, and I don't know why it wasn't flagged during development. You don't even need to rely necessarily on the Samus loses her powers in an accident at the start of the game trope to make collecting items make sense. You could perhaps do something radical and make all the powers discovered new and original. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I know, it's way too much to ask for a new game to be new. Prime was also guilty of recycling items, but it did have plenty of original abilities to its name, which felt more natural because in those games Samus's suit was modded and fit to purpose depending on the adventure she was currently on. Unlike in Other M where the suit is just the same as Super Metroid, because everything has to look like the classics, man, everything has to look like the classics. And speaking of things emulating the classics, how about those controls? Apparently the use of the nunchuck was vetoed in development so the interface would reflect that of an NES controller. And by golly gosh, why? For all intents and purposes, for this title, Metroid is a 3D action game a la Ninja Gaiden, Devil May Cry, etc. Raw combat is now a core part of gameplay, being trapped in rooms with enemies and being asked to take them out in hordes. Bosses lack that puzzle element they had in Prime and are mainly about precise movement and just getting them hits in, yeehaw! The decision to map a game like this to a D-pad and 2 buttons was not a wise one. But anyway, before I blow the system wide open, I'm gonna talk about some things it actually does well. Hooray! Number 1. The game runs good, most of the time. Can't believe that's worth bringing up, but it is. Number 2. Samus is now able to do flashy takedowns where enemies can be taken out all stylish. Other M respects the player's intelligence just enough to not have a massive giant button over the enemy's head saying do the context-sensitive move like other games would. You just charge your beam and go in for the kill when you can visually tell with your eyes that the enemy is vulnerable. Even Zelda games don't give us the benefit of the doubt on that one, so good job. Number 3. The game doesn't outstay its welcome. I know that might sound a bit backhanded, but it's true. The game presents its mechanics and the game is just long enough to use them all to the fullest. The title doesn't have loads of extraneous stuff that it then runs out of game to actually use. By the time the player beats the game, it feels like everything came into practice and nothing Samus could do was left unimplemented by the game's design. Which of course leads us on to the bad things. Number 1 bad thing. Okay, I'm going to stop numbering now actually. For a combat-heavy action game, it is bare bones as hell, and who can blame them when they were forced to use 2 buttons. There really was an opportunity here to make a new kind of technical action game where basically every attack is from a firearm. We could have had beam combos, switching between different firing types or carrying out button presses with different timings for different effects. Unfortunately, there's one combo, fire, and every new beam just replaces the last with the missiles relegated to first-person mode, which is really where the controls tumble into a ditch, but give me a moment before I get to that. The developers really should have looked for a way to retrofit classic Metroid abilities into this new combat style. Like, imagine combos that involved the Shine Spark, power bombs, or screw attack. You could maybe shoot a guy down and then ram him into the wall with the speed booster, or combo a guy, morph ball in, and leave a power bomb before jumping away. The game is still trying to stay true to classic Metroid, though, so when you get these items they become just as OP as they were in the 2D games. And then suddenly there's not much reason to even do combat anymore. The only move that was retrofitted for this new combat system was the charge beam, which is the cornerstone of its only real one mechanic. Beams lock onto targets, so their impact is made pretty negligible. Instead, you're reliant on charge shots to deal real damage. Items can be acquired to increase the charge's speed, but the fastest way to do it in combat is to hold the shoot button down during a quick dodge, which will give Samus an automatic charge shot. Chain these dodges together and bish bash boosh, you can create some real carnage. The maneuver is just too easy to trigger though. Just tap a direction when an attack is incoming and Samus dodges. There is no way to do an unsuccessful dodge. If maybe we had an extra button or 2, dodging could have been its own separate move, and then timing one at the right moment could have been what activated the auto charge on the beam cannon. A similar perk to say Witch Time in Bayonetta. This of course didn't happen, and what we end up with is a combat system where the player will just end up tapping a direction whenever an attack is incoming, timing be damned, and then suddenly be perfectly out of danger with a full-blown charge. This being as easily exploitable as it is just makes the combat a yawn later on. Usually I'd advocate for some kind of scoring system to encourage better play, but there really isn't enough here to justify such a thing. And then of course we have first-person view. Putting the somewhat unreliable nature of motion controls to one side for a moment, this just doesn't really work. Having to plant your feet squarely on the ground to aim in first person isn't a new concept, just usually it's done with a press of a button and not by having the player completely change the position they're holding the controller in and then locking the view into place unless another button is held down. Maybe this would have worked better. No, I'm not even gonna say maybe. If the gosh darn nunchuck had moved Samus around, then there could have been a first person button, and then upon transition to the new viewpoint we'd already have the pointer facing the screen, instead of having to do these straight up ninja moves with the sideways remote. Also, we wouldn't don't have to move around a 3D environment with a D-pad, which Nintendo pioneered a whole console's controller to avoid us having to do. Because first person is pretty clunky, the game goes out of its way to nerf like the entire world once you enter it. Like, check this out, I'm in first person here, but until I turn around I don't aggro these bugs. The game of course goes into slow-mo for a few seconds to allow you to get to grips with the new viewpoint, but one feature that doesn't get nearly enough emphasis, even though missile expansions 8 hours into the game will still explain to you what they do, is the first-person dodge. Yeah, did you know that when in first person, if an attack is incoming and the screen goes a bit yellow, you can shake the remote to do a dodge? And yes, this can also be used to auto-charge your beam. The final nail in the combat coffin, though, goes to the health system. Metroid, once known for its nail-biting tension when exploring new undiscovered areas while low on health and ammunition, now lets Samus recharge such things by just standing still. You'll need to be a bit low on health for this to happen, but as for missiles, anytime you like, really. It just means instead of fighting tooth and nail in a dire situation to come out on top with low health, you'll just run into a corner and hold A. Enemies dropping health encourages actually fighting those enemies, and in a goddamn third-person action game, that is what you want the player to be doing. In Ninja Gaiden, Ryu has to go in for the kill if he wants health back. You're encouraged to keep hacking and slashing to keep breathing. For a survival game such as Metroid, plus a Metroid game that wants to be a hardcore action title, this is a rather big failing. And holy crap, we're not even onto level design, which is almost the most important thing a Metroid game needs to nail. Invisible walls. Invisible walls everywhere. You have to get this item the way we want you to because we designed the map badly and didn't account or care about the space jump. The camera angles the game gives you also can't help but frame the world as a bit boxy and cardboard cutout-esque, which is a problem previous 3D Metroid games didn't suffer from. This space station is weird anyway though, it feels like the most inconveniently huge place to examine wildlife. Fusion was 2D, so who gave a shit? Prime mostly takes place on weird alien temples and shit, so who cares? But the bottle shit? But the bottle ship is supposed to be a real place people can do research on. But it doesn't really give that impression. Okay, so to get to the only food I saw in the game, you either go through the jungles of Sector 1, or go through Sector 3, which is, literally on fire. Previous 3D games got away with a lot of cool vertical levels, but here everything is spread out, and if anything does get momentarily vertical, the map system will make you wish it hadn't. For some reason, the map is just a 2D image of a bunch of squares and circles. I wonder what previous room this rectangle's supposed to represent. Like, how am I supposed to remember what place is what when shit's as vague as this? I guess they couldn't be bothered to include a 3D map in their 3D game. We don't even get room names on the map. I wonder if the map was the reason the level design doesn't have much verticality, because anytime anything is vaguely on top of each other, it becomes super confusing. The real black mark on the level design, though, is its forced linearity. There's the fact the game just straight up gives you an objective marker, which other games have done as an optional feature, but here it's probably the most unnecessary it's ever been because of how railroaded things are anyway. In previous games, doors almost always had an in-game reason for being shut, but in Other M they'll just lock themselves down whenever to prevent exploring earlier areas. Like, take this door. No reason for it to be shut, but the objective is through a different door, so I guess they saw some playtester use the wrong one, get lost for a fraction of a minute, and were just like, lock it down, screw it! The absolute best part of the game is when after all is said and done, the player is allowed to freely explore the ship and track down all the items they may have missed. This is when for a couple of hours the game almost feels like a Metroid title. Items placed in inventive locations that must be discovered through keen knowledge of the environment. Where all the moves are put to use in an open area, Samus can freely explore. It's fun. Then of course you get all the items and turns out all you're getting for your work is some concept art. Samus says you're cool though, you big nerd.
Perfect. Congratulations.
I don't know, I'm just kinda used to a little more, you know? Some sexy pics, secret ending? Happy ending? Well, happy ending certainly isn't what I think when I think Metroid series, because we're not doing too good. How does Other M, though, stack up after all these years? Well, now that the in-the-moment confusion has died down, I've got to say that the way I see it now, gameplay-wise, seems like a bit of a missed opportunity, if anything. Yeah, the story was awful, the music is a downgrade, the environments are bog standard, they literally forgot to make the final boss fight, but maybe if Team Ninja had been allowed to do their own thing, we could have at least gotten a nice little action exploration game with some cool combat. But what we ended up with is a janky, shallow game that fails as a Metroid Metroid as well as being its own flawed new brand of adventure title. Because maybe with just a bit of common sense, could have been some badass stuff in here. As much as I prefer the whole weighty suit of armor brand of Samus body language, the animations here are tight, yo. If tonally not very consistent with the franchise, in terms of technical expertise, they are the most impressive in the series. Enemies can mess you up in this game, man. You can see where Team Ninja's talent shines through. As for most things Other M did though, whether it be gameplay or story, it basically had enough wrong with it to piss a lot of people off, to such a degree that not only will there probably be no more third-person Metroid action games, there might not be any big-budget Metroids again, period. As of this recording, we'll just have to see what Nintendo does next with the property. Oh yeah, and the answer is basically still yes.